All right, so let's have a quick note on Strawson's terminology before we get started. So Strawson uses some very atypical terminology. Again, a little bit annoying. He's not just using his own definition for things, but he's using names for views that are just not used by anyone else. And this is maybe slightly a rhetorical move to really emphasize how differently he's viewing things. So at the start of the paper, he talks about optimists, pessimists, and skeptics. So for Strawson, optimists are compatibilists, people who think that, even if determinism is true, we can have free will and moral responsibility. Pessimists are incompatibilists or libertarians. He doesn't really distinguish the two very clearly. And skeptics will be people like hard determinists, hard incompatibilists, and impossibilists. So you might think it's weird. Well, why would libertarians count as pessimists? They're people who think that we have free will and that it involves indeterminism or that it's incompatible with causal determinism, depending on which definition of libertarianism you go with. To understand this, you have to think about Strawson, when he's talking about optimists, pessimists, and skeptics, are thinking about people's response to determinism. So if determinism turns out to be true, then the compatibilist is optimistic about us having free will and moral responsibility. The incompatibilist and libertarian is going to be pessimistic, because the libertarian here might think, well, if determinism is true, we're not, at least not as responsible, or perhaps not at all responsible. And the incompatibilist will say, well, we're not free and responsible because determinism is true. The skeptic here is a skeptic. There may be independent reasons from determinism to think that we're not free and responsible, but there. So with these definitions in mind, let's get to the first aspect of Strawson's view. This is our actual practices and the reactive attitudes. So Strawson described at the beginning of the paper what he calls some commonplaces about our actual practices. One of the main things he focuses on here are what he calls reactive attitudes. So reactive attitudes are attitudes like resentment and gratitude. It gives a long list, but it can also include things like indignation, contempt, praise. The things, the attitudes that we have in response to people's behavior. So someone wrongs you, you might feel resentment. Someone wrongs a friend, you might feel indignation. Someone helps you out, you might feel gratitude. Someone does something exemplary, you might feel admiration. Your attitudes here are all sort of reactive to something that happens. So something happens, and then there's a reaction. And Strawson here also invokes this concept of quality of will. So as far as I know, I don't think this is something that comes up before Strawson, but for Strawson, someone's quality of will is the extent to which they display or manifest or possess good or ill will when they act. So someone who wrongs you would be manifesting ill will or expressing ill will. And then your response, your reactive attitude of resentment to that ill will, your reactive attitude would be really responding to that ill will. That person has said, we've basically communicated that I don't think much of you. I'm doing this bad thing to you because I don't think much of you. And your response of resentment, of being kind of angry with them, is a way of responding to that ill will. And conversely, when somebody does something nice and they help you out, they're showing goodwill towards you, and you might feel gratitude towards them for that. In short, reactive attitudes are responses to quality of will on Strawson's view. It says the object of these commonplaces is to try to keep before our minds something it is easy to forget when we are engaged in philosophy, and especially in our cool contemporary style, namely what it is actually like to be involved in ordinary interpersonal relationships, ranging from the most intimate to the most casual. So Strawson here is saying, like, we have to really focus on what it's like to be in relationships, what it's like to be engaged with one another. This should be the sort of focus of our thoughts about free will and moral responsibility. Because as we saw in the previous lecture, if you focus on the metaphysical issues and you find out that we don't have free will and responsibility as a result of reflecting on those metaphysical issues, that's going to have implications for our personal relationships. But Strawson wants to say that, no, we shouldn't be focusing on the metaphysical stuff first. We should be focusing on our personal relationships, these commonplaces of engaging and being around with people, of being participants in society with them. But notice here as well that Strawson's sort of focusing on phenomenology. He's not focusing on the phenomenology of acting freely in the way that we saw that some free will theorists do, but rather the phenomenology and experience of being in relationships with others. So when we're thinking about quality of will and good and ill will, Strawson thinks that there's a general demand for others to, and ourselves to manifest and express goodwill from the people we have relationships with. So with your friends and family and others in society, we want them to, show us goodwill, to help us out, to be kind, to be friendly. And that's a demand on us. And when that demand is not met, that's when we respond to people with the reactive attitudes. So the weird thing about Strawsonianism, or Strawson, is that he thinks that you only feel resentment, and resentment here is a kind of moral anger towards things that have affected you directly, or when people have wronged you yourself. So if somebody betrays your trust, steals from you, resentment is an appropriate reaction. If somebody wrongs your friend, or family member, or someone you care about, then indignation is I would think of these in general as being sort of focused forms of moral anger. It's not just general moral anger towards injustice, but moral anger that's focused on particular things. Importantly here, Strawson thinks of these as natural and normal responses. Things that we see later on. This is quite important. Importantly for Strawson, he thinks that we always have these attitudes. Sometimes we excuse people from them. So he says, to the first group belong all those which might give occasion for the employment of such expressions as he didn't mean to, he hadn't realized, he didn't know, and also all those which might give occasion for the use of the phrase he couldn't help it, and when this is supported by phrases such as he was pushed, he had to do it, it was the only way, it left him no alternative. So the first group here is people who are excused, people who are excused from these attitudes. When people fall under any of these conditions, like not meaning to do it, not realizing, they're in a kind of situation-specific, under a situation-specific consideration that excuses them from negative attitudes. So somebody pushes you on the train, and it turns out they pushed you because the train came to a sudden halt. You're going to excuse them from anger, resentment, indignation, because it wasn't really their fault. Like, they weren't really manifesting ill will at what they did. They were just acting as a result of the train moving. So there's no ill will, so no negative attitudes result. In another group, you have people who are exempted. So when it comes to an exemption, Strawson suggests two ways of thinking about this. On the one hand, it can be because of something temporary, and the other is because of something more permanent. So in the temporary category, you have things like he wasn't himself. He's been under great strain recently. He was acting under post-hypnotic suggestion. People acting out of character, people being stressed, people being manipulated. But then in other cases, it's something a bit more permanent. Like, he's only a child, he's a hopeless schizophrenic, his mind has been systematically perverted as purely compulsive behavior on his part. This is more permanent because it's more long-standing. It's not something that happens over the course of a few days. So whilst you're a child and you develop into an adult, being a child is a sort of exempting condition because it's something, or a permanent exempting condition because it lasts for a long time. It's not permanent in the sense it's irreversible, but long-standing would be a more accurate way to put it. So the same with compulsive behavior or your mind being systematically perverted. And when he's thinking of a hopeless schizophrenic, he's thinking of somebody suffering from a severe mental illness, perhaps using less politically correct terms of this era. So importantly for Strawson, we excuse people, we're only sort of letting them off certain attitudes. We don't change our general attitude towards them. When we exempt people, we view them in a different way. So he says, exemptions invite us to view the agent in a different light from the light in which we should normally view one who has acted as he acted. So here you might think, well, aren't excuses also doing that, just on a very temporary basis? So there does seem to be
not a clear line between excuses and exemptions. So temporary exemptions seem to have a very similar form to excuses. But one way of perhaps thinking about it is an excuse is that you're still viewing the person as open to negative reactive attitudes. It's just there's something very specific to the act at that moment that gets them off the hook from anger and other attitudes. Whereas an exemption, there's something that, even if it's temporary, it would affect all their actions at that time. It's not just about the particular act of pushing, but about everything they're doing on that day because they're stressed or under post-hypnotic suggestion.